Welcome back, degenerates. There's 2,000 of us here now, so I thought now it's actually time for something useful. Today we're gonna look at an idiot-proof way of tattooing grey wash. We're gonna go through a step-by-step system of how to execute this marvelous looking rose. However, you must already know how to draw or paint a rose. Remember, if you can draw it, you can definitely tattoo it. If you take one thing from this whole video, is if you can draw it, you can tattoo it. Now here's the good news. This can all be taught, unless you have any mental or physical disabilities. But even then, I keep seeing people on Instagram with no arms, producing better paintings than most of us. So we can do this. Now this today is not an art theory lesson. So I'm just gonna assume that most of you here already know how to draw a simple rose properly. Guys, there's nothing worse than a competent tattooist with no art skills, because then they're just executing trash properly. Typically, you'll find that to be the older generation of tattooists that are grumpy now and salty and bitter because you guys, the young guns, are now taking over. I'd much rather see someone with good artistic ability but lacking tattoo skills, because these people tend to overperform the second they figure out the mechanics of tattooing. And honestly, tattooing is really not that hard. From this point on, I won't be giving advice on individual tattoos you guys sent me without seeing a drawing of it first. Unless we establish you already have good art skills and the questions you're asking are purely technique based, because otherwise I'm going to be assisting your artistic incompetence with better execution, which is obviously not good. This is now a new requirement. I love it when you guys send me stuff, but I have to keep you on the right track. Next month, I'm gonna make a YouTube membership and I'm gonna figure out how I can most efficiently help and communicate with you guys that take this craft seriously, because I'm too busy and I wear many hats. So I can't really be answering how to execute an opaque silver portrait if we don't know how to draw a simple rose. But we'll get there and we'll communicate that as well. A little bit here and a little bit in the membership. Anyway, let's get into it. Now I want you degenerates to book in a client for the week after you watch this video. Until then, we're gonna prepare together. You'll do the tattoo step by step, like how I show it to you in the video. You can take screenshots of the steps, but I will also post each individual step in the members club, from step 1 to step 8, or however many it's gonna be. And then when you tattoo this rose, you will also take pictures from step 1 to step 8. Exactly like I did. You're gonna send me the unedited photos, step 1 to step 8. We're gonna figure out the platform, how we're gonna communicate. Then we're gonna go through all the 8 steps together. Now with the channel still quite small, I still have the time to actually read all the comments, and perhaps I will give you some personal advice as well. Okay, step 1, design. Like I said before, this is not an art theory class, so we're not gonna waste too much time on the design. Now what you're gonna do, you're gonna choose a rose quite similar to this one, with quite well-defined petals and a lot of contrast. Nothing too fancy, nothing too overwhelming or photorealistic. You will go and find the body part you intend to tattoo on, and you will design directly on the body part. Always do that. Always design directly on the body part you intend to tattoo on. If you're doing consultations, always take a picture of the client's body part and then tattoo directly on their body. And that's really good for the client as well, because then they can actually visualize how the tattoo is gonna look on them. Next, you're gonna remove the background from the rose and then do some sexy chiaro scuro. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but it sounds really fancy. You're gonna do some research what that means. That's not an art theory lesson. We'll talk a little bit more about design and the simple art principles or whatever that you need for tattooing in some future videos. Today, we're gonna focus purely on execution of this rose. You will have some homework because you will draw this rose before you're tattooing it. So you're gonna send me all the steps from step 1 to step 8, plus the drawing of the rose. If you're serious about this craft, you will draw it the same size as you're gonna tattoo it. And for those who are really serious, you can also tattoo it on fake skin and send me that as well. Prepare. The more you prepare, the better it will be. Step 2, stencil. You will start the stencil with all the major shapes, but just the petals. And yes, you will hand stencil the whole thing. You won't always have to hand stencil, but for the sake of this exercise, you do. You can make an actual hand stencil, but you can also make a hand stencil in your iPad or your Wacom or whatever. Just no digitally generated stencils. That's it. Anyway, when you're doing the stencil, be sure to pay close attention of how the petals are actually arranged and how they're structured. And pay close attention to all the shapes. Start the stenciling on the outer petals, on the bigger shapes, and work your way in. No specific reason. Then identify all the true blacks and be really cognizant of how and why these shadows formed in these areas. To quickly identify all the true blacks and shadows on your rose, you can play around with the sliders in Photoshop or in Procreate for the children listening to this. But never leave it edited like that whilst doing the stencil. What you can do is make a screenshot and put it next to you when you're actually tattooing, but probably won't be necessary. That's just a quick and easy way of how to identify all the structural shadows that keep your design together so you can have a good foundation. Next, identify the midtones and mark them in with a hard line or perhaps dotted line if that's what you're into. When you're satisfied with the overall look of your rose, now identify all the little creases, folds and interesting textures and mark them in as well. It's important not to get carried away here though, because that might add unnecessary confusion. And that's why that's the last part. Identify the highlights and the skin breaks and mark them in as well. If it helps, you can cross-hatch the shadows in. It's going to make the stencil look a little bit neater, but I'm not sure if it actually helps. Sometimes it's really distracting because you can't see the actual tonal value when you're administering the ink into the skin over the stencil. Proceed with caution. Stencil done. All right, material and equipment quickly. So we're going to just use black ink and we're going to mix our own grey wash. We're going to make 100% black, 50% black, 25% black, and 12.5% black. So nothing fancy going on here. The needles are going to be 3 liner from Killer Ink, 7 Magnum, 15 Magnum, both soft edge, both Cheyenne. The machine is a 3mm AliExpress Flux knockoff for £100. So I don't want to hear any excuses. Never use the original, check this video why. Or this video comparing them. If you're using the original, don't join. Step 3, permanent stencil. I'm gonna assume the tattoo you're doing won't be a filler, so just ignore the smokes and shapes are on my one. I'll get to that later though. You will outline the rose in the same sequence just like we've done the stencil. You're gonna start with the big shapes, the outer petals from outside in. Now here it will matter where you start because you're gonna warm up when you start on the bigger shapes, and then when you get to the more difficult and intricate part, you're gonna be all Gucci. Now here you will use the 12.5 solution, so super light. Now of course we could do the darker areas with a darker solution, but this will add unnecessary confusion at this stage. So we'll do all of this with the lightest 12.5. Very gently, and you're gonna try to stay as consistent as possible. So same hand speed, same dab, same angle, of course if the body part allows it. Really take your time with this and try to do the lines as clean and consistent as possible so you set yourself up for a good tattoo with a good foundation. Make sure the reference and the stencil are as close as possible to the body part you're tattooing. This way you can have a quick glance at it as often and easy as possible, so you don't have to turn around, change your body posture or your hand position. Trust me, this is important. And at this point, you will take the first picture. Take a good picture as well, so reduce the exposure a little bit. Try to have as little glare as possible. Also shave the body part properly. Don't just shave around the exact same spot where you're gonna put the rose. It's gross. Just shave the whole thing, the leg or the arm. I don't know what you're gonna be tattooing. Hair is gross. And don't worry about the lines not being perfect. This is not the fine line Olympics. We can and will get back to them later. Step 4, sketching in. Now this stage is going to be strange to everyone except the fine line clones. You will still use a 3-liner and start shading in the shadows. In this stage we're going to be super light and we're only going to sketch in the blacks and the dark tones. The blacks with a 25% solution and the darks with a 12.5% solution. And again, we're gonna go from dark to light. And we're gonna consult the screenshot we've done previously that helps us to identify the structural shading that keeps our rose together. Stay super surfacey and try to cause as little damage and skin trauma as possible. That's gonna be almost like a stippling technique, but not quite. The goal of step 4 is to have the whole stencil sketched in, and that's gonna eliminate all the confusion, stress, and frustration. It's gonna be super easy to proceed from here. In step 4, you should almost be able to see how the whole tattoo is supposed to look like, just lighter. All the big shapes, all the small shapes, medium shapes, and little detail and texture in the petals. Everything has to be sketched in. That's why it's called a permanent stencil. When you're sketching in the shadows, always follow the shapes and flows of the design. Don't get carried away here. Take your time, take a break if you need one, be extremely mindful of the shapes. Hang your needles out enough so you don't drag the plastic tip of your cartridge on the skin surface, and so you have enough control. but not too far so your needles start to clip. Now you could proceed with a 3-liner all the way and have some fun, but then you have to set the tattoo up a little bit differently. And also you'd have to pay closer attention so you get the shading as homogeneous as possible. I myself got carried away here and almost desaturated my Instagram and put fine line in my bio. But I realized I've got a spine and actual skills, so I snapped out of it. On bigger pieces, that isn't as practical if you want to finish in one day. Although if you're working on a bigger piece and don't finish in a day, that's a great way of setting yourself up for the next session. So you sketch in your stencil permanently like that. And then you can be even looser with it. When you're a seasoned professional and got experience, more often than not, that's a complete waste of time, unless you're looking for a specific texture. But for now, this system will be great help and foolproof. Now it's true that it's perhaps not the best idea to recommend this technique to beginners because of the potential overworking of the skin and the unnecessary trauma to the client. But I thought long and hard about it, and I came to the conclusion that because of the clarity this system offers, there'll be a lot less overworking because of stress and frustration. Just clean execution. Now this technique's not only for roses, by the way. I do that shit for portraits as well, sometimes. If the portrait's small enough, or if I'm looking for a specific texture, again, like I said previously. But that's not limited just to roses. That can be transferred to anything really. For super detailed stuff, you might run into some issues and you might be overworking the skin. It's good for things with these kind of structures and where you want that shape juice to come through. And it's very fun to work like that as well. But if you're trying to make a bigger composition as quickly and as efficient as possible, that's a waste of time. That step, at least, the permanent stencil step. Now with the permanent stencil done to our satisfaction, it's time to introduce step 5, the blacks. We're only going to administer the blacks in the parts we identified earlier. Only these parts. Don't get cute here. This is also the first time we're going to use a magnum on this tattoo. I used a 15 magnum for all of it because I was late on the order. I wish I had a 7. But you're going to use a 7 magnum soft edge and start putting in the blacks. You'll always shade in the direction that you see the actual shapes. From the line we've done previously out. You will again take your time with this and try to be as clean and consistent as possible. For the bigger patterns, you can use a 15 mag, and for the smaller ones, the 7 mag, both soft edge. Always use a soft edge. You're going to be doing super small, controlled and consistent circles closer to the edges, so closer to the lines, and then you're gonna flick them out a little bit. Point is, we don't want any hard edges in the shadows. We're trying to achieve a smooth transition later on. If you're right-handed, clockwise circles, and if you're left-handed, counterclockwise circles. If you're clever and made a screenshot of the adjustment we've done before in Photoshop, now you can jump back and consult the reference if all the blacks are in the right place as planned. Planning being the key words here. It's all about planning and then executing your plan. Later on, when you develop a bit more tattooing technique and art skills, you can let things happen a bit more organically and take some more liberties. But for now, when we're still developing that technique and skill, we're going to compensate for that with a lot of drawing, preparation, planning, and strategy. Stage 6, shaping. Now, this is where the fun and juicy part begins. Here's where we're going to start to use a 50% solution, and we're going to start defining the shapes and volumes of the rose. We're again going to be paying close attention to the shapes of the rose, and we're going to shade in the general directions of them. At this stage, we're not going to be doing any circles anymore. We're only going to shade unidirectionally and in a pendulum fashion. From the solid black outwards, we're going to only shade unidirectionally. So we're going to be feathering out the black. So no back and forth. And the longer shapes and textures, we're going to be doing in a bit of a pendulum fashion. You also might want to be using that technique if you want to achieve a homogeneous block of color shaded in. But when you're doing this on a larger surface, it's good to change the directional angle of your needles relative to the skin, and then lay the secondary layer of magnum pixels with a 90-degree shift. Otherwise, it's going to be super visible from what direction you were shading, but that's okay as long as it's intentional. It can be a good effect, but it has to be intentional. So there's your permanent stencil done, the solid blacks done, and the shaping or the dark tones done. Stage 7, mids. Now here it's going to be a lot of the same scenario. We're still going to follow all the shapes with our needles, but this time we're going to assault the client with a 25% solution. You're going to want to make sure you rinse out your needle cartridge each time before each stage so you're absolutely sure what tone you're working with, and that's going to be super important for your confidence, so you know exactly what tone you have. Now, 100% black is going to look virtually the same as a 50% black when it's shaded in with a circular motion with the same pressure as normal black. Same as the 50% is going to look virtually the same as the 25, and so on. So it's going to be super important to always rinse out your needle cartridges fully before starting the next stage. In stage 7, we're going to be shading the midtones the same way, from dark to light. Always go from dark to light. Mostly unidirectional and controlled, but in some places we will use the pendulum technique as well. And in this step, we're going to be even more careful because it's going to be way too easy to go too dark and then later regret it and post it on Instagram with a disclaimer in progress. So really take your time here, really pay attention to the shapes, try to imagine the rows in a 3D space and don't just mindlessly copy. The goal of stage 7 is to almost fully saturate everything except for the light tones and make it nice and full and juicy. No circular shading, no messiness, no panic. Just calmly follow the shapes. Nice and clean and slow. Stage 8. Light tones, touch-ups, and highlights. Now here at the last stage, we don't have much to do at all. That should be the quickest part, but nonetheless important, except for potentially the permanent stencil stage. If you followed all the steps previously correctly, this should be a breeze. Now in stage 8, we're only going to use the 12.5% solution with just a 7 Magnum soft edge. And a 15 you can only use for the background. But now we're mostly going to use the pendulum technique and a bit of unidirectional dark to light. So now it's the other way around. In the previous steps, we used more of the unidirectional dark to light technique to flick out the shadows, to feather out the shadows and create smooth transitions. But now we're going to be using more of the pendulum technique and less of the unidirectional dark to light. Also be careful not to overdo it here. Let the tattoo breathe. Make sure you don't choke it and saturate everything and leave no skin breaks and places for highlights. And again, try to really imagine the rows in a 3D space, consult your reference, consult your stencil, and commit. On each petal the same. Consult your reference, consult your stencil, and commit. You see, from stage 7 to stage 8, there's a big difference. So don't underestimate the value and the importance of this step. Even though we're just working with a 12.5% solution, it's really important to still stay focused, still stay patient, and don't rush. You still must follow the shapes of the roses with the same attention and rigor as all the stages that came previously. And only when you're fully done with the lightest tones, now look at some potential mistakes and technical issues and correct those. That's the only time you're going to use a 3-liner again and go correct some lines, correct some shading, and make sure the gap between the lines and the shading is not visible. That's the #1 tell of how you can spot an amateur. So be super mindful of that. When all that's done and you're happy with how the rose looks, now you can take out your white. Be super mindful again not to overdo it. The rose should look good enough without any white whatsoever. That's not always going to be the case, but for the sake of this exercise, it is. We'll talk about designing and the art side of things for tattooing in future videos. For example, this missed opportunity here where I could turn the whiskers into smoke, but I only seen it after the fact. A huge missed opportunity. You win some, you lose some, it is what it is. Anyway, look, in this video, I just put down the basics of how you can approach this tattoo for our exercise. And look, if you're still uncomfortable with your technique and you think you may cause too much trauma to the skin with that system, you can skip stage 4, the permanent stencil technique. But in this case, don't send me it though. That's a specific exercise we're doing now, so please follow the steps as they are. Just be super light with it. I run my machine at the lowest setting on the fake knockoff flux at a 5. Super slow. The follow-up video to that one is going to be in the members only tab on YouTube, and I should be able to more clearly identify what your problems are based on the results you guys send me in. The good news is the channel is still super small, so I still have time to respond to your comments and to see every DM you guys send me. On Flipping Instagram, that has to change as well. I'm going to still figure out the communications, probably Discord or something. We're going to figure it out. I don't really want to move over to Patreon because that's going to make it harder for you guys installing a new app, making new accounts and all that jazz. It's nonsense. So I'm going to try to keep it on YouTube, but we'll see. Another thing, don't just book your client in for a rose and don't tell him anything. Communicate to the client what you're doing. You're going to be sending this tattoo out for critique, whatever. You're in the stage of learning. Be honest with your client. Ask your mom, tattoo her, or your dad, or your dad mom. When you're sending your things in, you can request to stay anonymous. You can request not to share your progress. But look, think of the other degenerates that also are learning. And your tattoo might be a good example of how we can all improve together. So it's no shame in learning. I'll show you some of my sins. You see, I don't want you to book in a tattoo and start blasting it mindlessly with no strategy, no plan, no preparation, and then keep doing that for 20 years. If you follow these steps and you have a record of it, it's going to be a lot easier to identify where you have to improve upon. And also, you're going to develop what works best for you. That's just a framework. This video is not about how a rose has to be done. This is some easy and clear defined steps that you can follow if you want to. And then when you get comfortable with your technique, you can add things, you can take things away, you can start it backwards for all I care. But as beginners, we have to be patient and strategic about the approach and be extremely mindful about every step of the process. Don't be a cowboy for 20 years and then start a podcast crying about the new generation because you didn't learn and you suck. And now you're too stuck in your ways to change. You won't just get better with time. You will improve the tattooing technique incrementally. Of course, you're gonna get used to your trash to facilitate bad techniques. You don't get better with time only. But look, anyway, it doesn't matter. Be better, keep pressing charges, stay toxic, and I'll see you in the next one.